so that way there was no jealousy. It could just be Sal. Back to the right, the Grumman Cougar, used by the Navy for many years off carriers in our first line of defense. Next is another Cougar, but this is a training version, a two-man version. A lot of fighters have a two-man version to check out the new guys and how to fly it and various things. Still to the right, the F-9F Panther from the Korean War. If you remember the movie Bridges of Tokari, that's William Holden was flying. But Ed McMahon flew them, and Ted Williams flew those in that. The airplanes on the left, I'll explain in a minute. We're going to make a little loop around, and I'll catch those on the short loop coming back. Back to the right is a Fury, the Navy version of the F-86. Came out after the Korean War, and we don't think they ever got into combat at all. Still right, the Douglas F-6 Skyray. If you could see this airplane from above the airplane, the wings are like a bat wing almost like a Delta. But that was the first Navy airplane to exceed the speed of sound at level flight, which it did in 1954. Now the large McDonnell F-3H-2 Demon single-engine airplane. Looks like it ought to have two, as big as it is. I guess they had a lot of trouble initially and lost quite a few of them, but I guess finally they got it worked out. To the left is in an effort to have some foreign airplanes, we have this Bristol Blenheim. This was made in Canada, but they also built them in the UK during the Second World War. Behind there, TWA is a Constellation. We think this is one of the oldest in existence. It was the 10th one ever built. Served in the Army during the war and then went back to TWA afterward. Oh, and there's some bags in the baggage cart over there. If anybody's missing a baggage, you get check your tickets when you get home. And gladly. In the back. Okay, coming around the corner is a Beechcraft. This is a C-45. Beechcraft made over 8,000 airplanes in this basic design. We're actually going to see a couple more of them in a little bit. That TWA over there was very fast for its day, 330 miles an hour. A very luxurious airplane in the late 50s, early 60s. The area straight ahead is our restoration area where we bring airplanes in when we first get them to drain them of everything. That darn ramp rattling away back there. It's off limits to everybody. We don't want anybody back there getting hurt. There's critters and snakes and things like that. But the airplane sitting behind the fence there with all the propellers was the last airplane to fly in here. It flew in here 3 years ago, December. I remember seeing it flying around. But it's a 1953 Avro Shackleton built in England. It was an anti-maritime shipping airplane. Big counter-rotating props on a 2,600 horsepower Rolls-Royce engine. And I guess that was the best way to apply all that power. But I always think it's neat. That thing up on top that looks like a spark plug is actually a radar sensor. If a radar beam sweeps across it, it knows which direction it came from, so it could help know what's going on. But the other thing is, underneath somewhere is a sniffer that can sniff diesel exhaust fumes. And we had a gentleman in here a couple months ago tell us how they would do that. They'd fly like over the Mediterranean at night, and if a submarine was on the surface recharging its battery, that sniffer would smell it and give them a direction, and they could go in and find them and drop stuff on their head if it came to that. And the Brits always name everything. That's Mr. McHenry. They had to name their airplanes. Okay, coming up on the right is a Beechcraft Starship, very modern-looking airplane, designed by Bert Bertan, the famous designer, with a canard in the front, that's called. And of course the rudders are in the wingtip along the side. Pusher engines, but even more advanced, the whole fuselage is built out of composite material, i.e. some type of fiberglass. It was way ahead of its time, and FAA didn't know what to make of it, so they had a lot of troubles. They only built 53 of them. Now to the right, the Caravel, it's a French-built Caravel. Came to our country in 1961. Very clean wing, and the engine's in the back. That white thing we think was added by a contractor later of some sort. The left, little Cessna 120, came out right after the war. Always amazed me how little that airplane. It is a little airplane. A lot of people learn to fly in it, though. Next, the Snow S2A, built by a gentleman named Snow in Aldie, Texas. It's a crop duster. I visited the factory in 1963. It's about the size of that building over there. It wasn't a big deal. Still on the left, a little twin Navion, a civilian airplane. Now back to the right, a little bit further back in history, 1951. The Vickers Viscount came from England. They say inside it's very first class. And those are turboprop engines. A turboprop is a jet engine through a series of gear that runs a propeller, just like the C-130 does today, but that was way ahead of its time. To the left, a twin Bonanza. This is what we call an off-the-shelf airplane. It wasn't designed for the military. They just bought the standard one and then modified it as required. Across the bridge over there are several airplanes with red on them. They're all Forest Service airplanes. They parked them here about 12 years ago and said, we're just going to be here a couple of years. Well, about a year ago they called us and said, you can have them. So now they're ours. I don't know what we'll do with them eventually. The large airplane with its tail to us was an experimental cargo airplane. The 14, they only built 2 of them, and for whatever reason it was never purchased by the military. Back to the left, a little white one with the pink and blue green downsides, a BD-4, 1968. Came out with a kit airplane. You sent off a bunch of money, they sent all these boxes, and you put it all together. Ta-da, you have an airplane. A lot of them were built, and I guess it had an excellent safety record over the years. Back to the right now, the brown airplane is a Martin 404. It was a feeder type airplane back in the 70s, but it ended up in Wyoming. A gentleman owned it, and he called us one day and said, how would you like a free airplane? He just wanted to get rid of it. We said, sure. So we sent our crews up there. One of my fellow tram drivers, a retired airline pilot, had flown that kind of airplane. So they got up there and got it going. But near Winslow, Arizona, coming down here, that right engine blew that cylinder right through the nacelle and trashed that engine. They had to make an emergency landing into, I think, somewhere up there. Well, 3.5 weeks and $15,000 later, we had our free airplane. We all know nothing is free, right? To left, little Cessna 150, another training airplane built by Cessna. I built thousands of those. Now the left, a little Aerocoop, kind of fascinating airplane, came out right after the war. They want to make it easy to fly. There are no pedals. It's all done with a yoke and levers or whatever. And we've learned recently there's a young lady named Jessica Cox. She's 29 and she flies that airplane. She's probably an instructor by now. Jessica was born with no arms. She flies that airplane with her feet. And one day, one of the tram drivers was talking about her, and somebody said, oh, by the way, she's in the tram in the back. She was here. She lives in Tucson. I've met her a few times. She's a motivational speaker. You can imagine why, dealing with life with no arms. To the right, we think it's the last tri-motor ever. It's a BT-125. Only built 23 of them. Nobody really ever ponied up to buy them, I guess. 1944, the government was worried about running out of aluminum. So they contacted the Budd Corporation to build stainless steel passenger railroad cars. And they built the Conestoga to the right out of stainless steel. They only built 13. I think the war ended and they just never found a need for it. Little Cessna there is a U-3A, is an off-the-shelf 310. But I want to mention the hangar behind. That's hangar number 4. That's our World War II Pacific Theater. Beautiful B-29 in there. There's a course in there, a P-51, P-63, and a lot of other stuff from that era. So I hope you get a chance to get over there. Little U-11A is an off-the-shelf airplane, Piper Aztec. Now the right is hangar number 3. That's our World War II European theater. B-24, B-26, no, B-25, A-26, C-47, and lots of other things from that era. So what we suggest is you come in the front door and look at all that, then you go out the back door, and there's a track on the floor you can follow and go out the back and go on over to hangar 4. To the left is a barracks built over at Davis Mountain during the Second World War to house the B-24 crews. We brought it over here to remind people, but they were around for a long time. Little midget Mustang's another kit airplane built by a gentleman here in town, then donated to us when he was too through with it. Now the right, a row of 3 airplanes back through here, kind of unusual and utility, various things. The first is a Mohawk used by the Army in Vietnam, probably for artillery spotting and whatever, all kinds of things. But I like to point out the little hearts on the nose gear down there. Each heart stands for a time it was hit in Vietnam, a bullet hole somewhere in it. I guess it could have been too bad or it wouldn't have been here. On over with O2 on the nose is a OB-10 Bronco. It was a forward air control in Vietnam during the latter part of the war. On over there with 901 is the O2 with an engine in the front and the back, and it was early in the war. But they're both FACs, or forward air control. The FAC would be in touch with the Army commander on the ground, and if the Army needed help, he'd call the FAC would go through the radio and scramble the fighters. We would come out, he rolls in and shoots a rocket, and this white puff of smoke comes up. We bomb off of that white puff of smoke. But he's talking to the ground commander all through the strike, and if he says, hey, we need it further, wherever, and he directs us throughout that. He was our boss the whole time. Okay, left, the F-101B model, the Voodoo. This is an interceptor version with a radar in the front, a two-man crew. It's about a 1.2 Mach airplane in the 60s. They were stationed here at Davis Mountain at that time. Now the next three are kind of unusual airplane called the variable geometry or swept wing. The wings fold back as it goes faster. First, the F-111 Aardvark. And you can kind of see from the shadow, and it looks like really like a dart almost. As the airplane goes faster, the pilot sweeps them back like that. Then when he comes back into land, he slowly brings them back out, almost straight out, not quite, but to greatly reduce the airspeed. And one day I was looking at that and looking at those pylons on the hanging down. They have to rotate too, otherwise it'd be a speed brake if it just stayed the way it is. So they must rotate as the wings come forward. And that was a fascinating airplane. If they ejected, the cockpit came out as a capsule, a great big parachute on top, and they just sit there, had an airbag underneath, come down and plunk, and open it up and step out. We used quite a few times very successfully. And it was about a 2.5 Mach airplane, very fast airplane. Next, the Panavega Tornado, or Tornado, however you want to pronounce it. These were developed in cooperation between the West German government, the English government, and the Italian government. Each of them had their own version. Obviously, this is a German version. They still train their pilots over at Holloman Air Force Base in Alamogordo, New Mexico. Now we have a Russian-built one, the MiG-23 Flogger. This one, we do have the wings all the way forward, just to give you an idea that, that's how it would do. This is a Mach 2 airplane. These were built in Estonia, or this one was built in Estonia. And somebody purchased it and tried to smuggle it into the United States. We don't know if it was in his baggage or what, but anyway, they caught him and took it away from him. He wasn't supposed to be bringing it in at the time, anyway. Over to the left, a very colorful airplane. I'll explain those when we come around them in just a minute. Straight ahead of us is a seaplane with yellow leading edge. That's a JRS-1, a mid-30s airplane. This airplane was a airliner in Hawaii for a while. Then it was sold and resold. Ended up in Alaska, and it was landing one day in a lake and hit something and sunk. It was in that lake almost 30 years. Finally, a Marine learned about it, got the Marine Corps to drag it up and bring what was left of it down here. Our volunteers spent 12 years restoring that airplane back to its present condition. There we go. We have about 300 volunteers here. Most of us, I spend 2 days a week, and that's probably the average. Back to the Navy airplanes now, the 84 to the right, the Skyhawk. This is a civilianized because of the N marking, probably owned by a company testing weapons or who knows what all. But next is the typical Navy A4 Skyhawk, 302 on the side. This is the kind of Senator John McCain was flying when he was shot down over North Vietnam. Well, we might as well mention, well, I think that, notice how the canopy looks. You'd say, well, how did they see out? Well, when we first get the airplane, we spray the interior with this stuff that greatly reduces the ultraviolet rays that eats the interior. It's just to keep them cooler and not cooking them up. Also notice that boom alongside the nose, that's air refueling probe, and I'll explain how that works when we get down to the tankers. Next to the right, a dark blue airplane, I guess it is a Navy's first night fighter used in Korea. Actually shot down 6 enemy airplanes with big radar in the nose, very advanced for its day. Later it was designated a trainer. The airplanes to the left are all Air Force airplanes. I'll cover those at the end of the tour as we come back this way right before the 390. Back to the Navy again on the right, the 315 is a Vigilante, one of the very fast airplane, a Mach 2 airplane. It was a bomber originally, then they added the stuff underneath there to make it a reconnaissance airplane as well. It could go out and take pictures of strikes and things like that. Next, the A6 Intruder. If you remember the movie Flight of the Intruder, that's what they were flying in that. That's a two-man version. Several of them, many of them were four-passenger electronic airplanes. They're just about to be restored. I mean, not restored, retired. Next, the A7. This is the Navy version. The airplane out in front that you saw in camouflage is the Air Force version of the same airplane. It's a bomber, a subsonic airplane. Those things hanging down on the wings are called pylons. And then they put racks on there with bombs all over it and fuel tanks on some. That airplane could carry 20,000 pounds of external stores, which is what it weighs without fuel. Amazing bomb load. Now the last one here is kind of a unique airplane, the AV-8 Harrier Jump Jet. This airplane can take off straight up. There's thrusters in the wingtip and the nose and tail to keep it level, and just after the star, that big thing pointing down, is the main thruster. Once it gets airborne, that slowly rotates back, giving it forward airspeed, and off it goes at 400 to 500 miles an hour. Our Marine Corps still has 4 squadrons of the later version of that. Over to the right is our restaurant that we've added. It's opened a year ago, Thanksgiving. So we're real proud to have it. It has good food, so if you're hungry after our trip, go on in there and grab a bite. Over to the right is our space gallery opposite the blue building. I'll tell you more about that when we come around behind it in a little while. Now to the left is our VIP row. Various reasons that they're considered that. The first is the Chickasaw, the first helicopter certified to carry the President of the United States, which was at that time President Eisenhower. Of course, Eisenhower, being the Army man, had the Army take care of it. Over to the right, a couple small airplanes. The first one's the F-5. These were built by Northrop. They built like 2,500 of them. But our government really could never really find a role. It was too limited on what it could carry and how much fuel. But a lot of South American countries have equipped their entire Air Force. NASA still does fly the later version for their astronauts to keep proficiency in flying. Next is the Alpha Jet, built in cooperation with the West German government and the French government. Didn't build very many. Sweden bought some of them, I understand. Now to the left, the blue and white airplanes, a VC-140, part of the VIP fleet by our country. We don't think a president ever rode in that we know of, but we did hear that Lady Bird Johnson would put the kids in there and go down to Texas, because they had a shorter runway, they could get in there with that. So LBJ started calling that Air Force 1/2. Back to the right, the F-86H, last version of the famous Sabre jet. Could go supersonic in a dive, it just could not maintain it in level flight. Still to the right, another older version of the F-86, an L model with the radar in the nose for being an interceptor. But I always have to tell a quick story about friends of mine flew these out of the LA area in the 60s, and at night they turned the radar scope all the way up and the whole canopy turned a bluish green, funny color. Then they turn out all the other lights and join up on an airliner. Think any of the UFO stories might have come. You can't do that kind of stuff anymore. It's a B-no. Still to the right, the F-84F, the swept-wing F-84, could actually go supersonic at a dive as well. Obviously used by the Thunderbirds for a while. Now to the left is a VC-118. This was Air Force One for President Kennedy and President Johnson. The jets were coming along at that time, but a lot of their runways were still too short, so they used this airplane. One of the often asked questions is this the airplane that brought President Kennedy back after the assassination, and the answer is no. They were using the jet that day. Those of us that are old enough to remember that. To the right, the earlier F-84, the straight wing, came out in 1948. Actually was used in Korea, though, and shot down a couple MiGs during that conflict. And still to the right is an example of the very first jet fighter built by our country, the P-80, or F-80 it was called at times. One of these was involved in the first all-jet dogfight in history, in which he shot down a MiG-15 in Korea. Coming up on the left, a large airplane, a Constellation. This was then General Eisenhower's airplane when he was commander in Europe after the war for a while. Mamie, his wife, had adopted Colorado as her home state. The Colorado state flower is the columbine, so that's what they painted on the nose and named him that. Later, when he was president, he had Columbine 2 and 3. To the right now is our lineup of the trainers. The first is a T-38, still being used today by the Air Force. They just went through an updating of an all-glass cockpit or various things. I flew it as an instructor for about 3 years. Fun little airplane to fly, very easy, simplistic, didn't have radar, didn't have inertial nav, all that stuff. It go about 1.2, 1.3. During the fuel crunch in 73, we had to land with 1,000 pounds. So if we went cross country, we would go to about 45 to 48,000 feet, and the fuel flow there was less than it was taxiing out in idle. That's how efficient it was at high altitude. Fun little airplane. Now the right to T-33 here. Lockheed made over 5,500 of these. Many different countries purchased them. Our country used them as a pilot trainer. I flew them right before I got my wings. Fun little airplane to fly. We've learned formation and instruments in it and everything. Back to the left now is the Orion P-3, and the reason it's on there, the VIP row here is this was an Admiral's airplane. It was greatly modified, and I guess it's pretty plush inside, which you can imagine. Back to the right is a Navy version of the T-33 called the Sea Star. They did some modification to make the back seat a little higher. I guess it's better for the instructor pilot to see the carrier, if they're going to hit it or not. Next, another T-33. That'll probably be traded someday to another museum that has something we would like. That's done quite often, I understand. Now we're really going back in history. The BT-14, Basic Trainer 14. During the Second World War. These were built to go to France, and we got some over there. Then, of course, the Germans took over France, so we couldn't send them there. So they ended up going to Canada, and Canada used them throughout the Second World War. The blue one over there is a BT-13, pretty similar to that one. This was our airplane used by our government. We built over 11,000 of them that trained many, many different young guys during the Second World War. To the right is our B-36. There's a good view of it, but I'll be telling you a lot more about it when we go. We'll circle around behind it. All right, and still to the right with 607 on the nose, pointing right at us, is an off-the-shelf DC-9 used by the Navy for whatever reason. I'll also talk about the Guppy over there, the big white one over there. Now I'd have to talk about these airplanes to the left. A gentleman named Firestone got this wild idea, and he bought 5 airplanes from the boneyard over there. They were about to be cut up, so they're not, ruining good airplanes. And he turned these artists loose on it, and they used this as their canvas. And you can see all the intricate painting on there. A lot of work goes into that. And then further, still left behind over there is a C-45, one of those Beechcraft, but it's got all kind of paintings on it. And at the end of the tour, you'll be dropped off right there around that corner. You can walk over here and look at them if you care to. Now to the right, pointing at us, a large 707. It's called BC-137. This airplane's claim to fame was in 1981 when the Iranian hostages were released. This airplane brought them home. When they entered U.S. airspace, they changed their call sign to Freedom 1. We don't think a president ever rode in it that we know of, but of course records are a little sketchy on that kind of stuff. I've got a ditch here I got to go through. I'll try to go through these smoothly. The airplane to the left, they say that's hieroglyphics, all those up and down things. I don't think it worked that well, but anyway. And the next one up here, I kind of like. Notice the guys on the side of the airplane hanging on, and then all the feathers on it. Imagine the amount of hours to do that. Pretty slick looking. It's on a C-117 airframe. We'll see a regular one here in a little while. Now to the right's a BT-13 Dragon, built in the early 30s as a bomber, but by the time the war came along, they were a lot bigger bombers, so it didn't really participate much. But after the war, a lot of companies snapped them up because it was a fast airplane, 285 mile an hour, which is pretty fast in that day. This one was purchased by the Great Lakes Coke Corporation, painted up kind of nice. And to the right, you have another one of those. This is on a Jetstar, it's called. This airplane was sitting in front of the hangar over there about a month ago, pure white. They painted it a basic white. Then they brought the artist out, and we'd watch every time we'd come out and see the progress they made. Finally got it all done. To the left is a 141. I don't know if you can see it from where you are, but that hump up on top has a hole in it. That's the air refueling receptacle. Kind of remember what that looks like, and I'll explain that when we get down to the tanker. But that is a C-141 that came out in 1963. We built 263 of them. Originally it was a lot shorter, and then in the 80s they took it back to the factory and added 23 feet of fuselage, some in front and some behind the wing. And I had an expert on my tram one day, and I said, well, they put new engines in. No, they didn't have to. Those are very powerful engines. They were retired about 5 years ago and replaced by the C-17. Coming up on the left, another one of those Beechcraft 8000. This is an A7. There's a navigator trainer in the Second World War. There's 4 navigator stations in the back. Those are not the original gear. We're trying to get the right ones. I think they just put them there to keep it off the ground. No way those would fold in there. Now to the right, the F-7F, the Tiger Cats. Look at a little airplane. These were on carriers going to the South Pacific when the war ended. The Navy didn't really like them, so what does the Navy do with things they don't like? They gave it to the Marines, right? So the Marines flew them in Korea and early into Vietnam. Some of those are still flying. There's a flight of 3 sponsored by somebody that flies around. To let the C-54, it's the kind of airplane that participated in the Berlin airlift in 1948 when Russia tried to lock us out of Berlin, and we flew everything, every necessity needed. We're pretty sure this airplane was on them because we first got it, we took some panels off and there was bits of coal and straw down in the bottom of it. This is also the kind that the candy bomber flew. Anybody know that story where the one guy noticed all these kids standing along the fence, so he started carrying candy and dropping out. He lives locally here and he shows up every now and then. To the right, the B-26 served in 3 different wars. It was in the Second World War, then it was in Korea, then they modified some for Vietnam, such as this. One of my fellow drivers wondered if those are 50 cal or 20 millimeters, so he measured and he went to the books and measured. Finally, one of the volunteers that brought it over from DM said, Chuck, well, we brought it over, didn't have any guns, so we went to Home Depot and got some PVC and painted it, so we don't let him forget it either. To the left, the C-82 Packet was the kind used in the Flight of the Phoenix movie, the original one out there in the desert. It was just an early on cargo airplane. The paratroopers really liked it because they could come out the back door and not worry about hitting a horizontal stabilizer. To right, another World War II raider, the Lockheed Vega PV-2 Harpoon, served mainly in the South Pacific. You can see it's got rockets and guns and carried bombs in the bomb bay. Had a unique feature. It could outrun a Japanese Zero. So if a Zero rolled in on it to shoot it down, they just drive off. Nice thing to have. Now they'll have the C-130. This is an A model. First designed in 1950. They're still making them today, 60 years later. The J model is the latest version. Has a 6-bladed prop, and it sounds different, but it sure looks the same. Those have flown in many, many, many different roles. Now the right, the Grumman HU-16 used to be called the SA-16. I have no idea why they changed the name on it. But you can see it could land on water or on a runway. In Vietnam, they would fly up and down the Bay of Tonkin, and if a fighter got hit and could make it to the water before he ejected, they could pick him up and get him home. And I guess that they did that several times. Now the right, my last of my Beechcraft 8000 outside enters, a C-45J model, was probably the very last version, built up to the latest 1965. Now the left, another 130, a D model, but we have it here mainly to show you these skis or skids. You might remember in 1999, a woman doctor in Antarctica had breast cancer and they had to get her out. So the New York National Guard took a 130 with those skis on, went down there in the dead of winter, which had never been done before, and got her out of there. Back to right now, the Convair T-29 Flying Classroom. It's called that because there's 16 navigator stations in the back. That's a Navy version. The Air Force flew the exact same version in the late 50s into the 60s. Now the right to T-39, the Sabre liner. All branches of our military flew them. It's just a little people hauler. But there was also a civilian version called the Sabre liner, one of the very first private jets available, or business jets. To right, another Convair like the last one, but this is called a 131, and it's normally configured with rows of seats, used by the Navy flying people and supplies in and out of Guantanamo Bay. Now on the left, a huge airplane. Just look at the size of that thing, C-133. As we go by, notice how the gear is on the outside of the fuselage. It's a big hollow tube. It was designed to carry the Minuteman missile, a huge solid-state intercontinental missile. I've seen pictures of it, and it really fills it up. They button it up, and those are 6,500 horsepower engines to get it off the ground. Built 53 of them. Of course, they were used in other roles. Now on the left, the C-117. This is the type of airplane back there that were all painted up. If you know what a C-47 looks like, you may think this is it, but it's actually a little bit bigger than a C-47 in all aspects. To the right, the C-123 Provider. These were all over Vietnam. A friend of mine flew them, and he said at one time he had 125 Vietnamese civilians in the back of it, getting them out of harm's way somewhere. But they also put spray bars on and sprayed the now infamous Agent Orange. I flew over many times while they were doing that. If somebody shot at them, we'd shoot back because they didn't have any guns. To the left, the C-124, old shaky. There's two floors and an elevator in the back for freight up and down. And those are some of the biggest conventional engines ever built, 3,800 horsepower out of 28 cylinders. But I think the most unique feature is there's a tunnel in the wing, and a crew chief could crawl out in flight and work on an engine. Had a gentleman a while back said, yeah, he changed a magneto on an outboard engine one time in flight. But that'd be fun. To the right now is a Korean-era airplane, the AP-2H Neptune, but they modified some 4 of them for Vietnam, such as this. Put that low-light television camera in the nose, a little radar underneath, put jets on it. There's guns in the back, and there's bomb bays, and there's a bomb bay full of bombs. They fly around Vietnam at night watching for bad guys and doing them in, I guess. When the Second World War came to an end, the Boeing company said, what are we going to do now? So they took the B-29 wings and redesigned the fuselage and came out with the C-97 here to the left. Ended up building 888 of them. They were used by all of our branches of service, but a lot of different countries flew them as well. This one actually came from Switzerland. Back to the right, in our Navy airplane, the S-2F Trekker. That thing on the right wing is a 70 million candle power searchlight. You might remember Neil